Well, guess what? Little baby girl. So my wife and I's second grandchild was born on Friday morning, 9:40. So her name is Hana, which means flower in Japanese, but she really looks like a peach. Like, babies are not that cute. They're kind of shrivelly and got funky stuff on them and everything, but she's really cute. Yeah, her head's like this. She has this massive mouth. Like when she cries, I'm afraid her head's going to like split in two. Anyway, so quite a joy, and mom and dad are doing well and learning about what it is to have two kids. Some of you heard I was hearing the wonderful baby gurglings of Opal this morning, thinking about fondly on that time. But also then, for those of you who are blessed to have grandchildren, when you take care of them, it's so wonderful, and they wear you out. Oh, our grandson Kai, he never stops. He just doesn't stop. He has like an on and off switch, no dial. And so he's on, and then off, and then like that for a little bit. He's a lot of fun. We went to see the train yesterday. He loves trains. Okay, I won't just go on about that. I would like to talk about the Gate of Sweet Nectar, and I think there's some copies of that are around, so people would just start passing those around. I didn't want to pass them out before the service because I thought it would be confusing for people. And this is the important text that we use throughout the month of October, where we focus on feeding hungry ghosts. And so this week and next week, I want to talk a little bit about that. The title again of the text, the title that we normally read is called Ambrosia Gate. And that is the standard translation by the Soto Zen Translation Committee. And if there's not enough, if people could kind of share a little bit. I'm not going to be reading everything inside of it. I'll just be pointing a couple of things out, and we'll get some more copies made for next week to make sure there's enough, because next week I'll kind of go through things in it a little bit more. But again, the Soto Zen Translation Project, which was a project put together to create some standardized translations within the Soto Zen school, which is what this temple belongs to. And we just use those translations, whether we think a different word would be better or not, because there's something to be said for standardization and cooperate with other temples and that kind of thing. So we use the standard translations for everything with very little change, which I'll talk about that next week, a place where we made some big changes. But in the title, we usually say Ambrosia Gate. I really prefer the translation, The Gate of Sweet Nectar. And those of you who are fortunate enough to know Kyogen Carlson Roshi, one of the founders of Dharma Zen Center up north, he was really nitpicky about this. He hated that people use the term ambrosia, because ambrosia is supposed to be food, right? That's in English, the ambrosia was a food of the gods, food of immortality. But this is actually liquid, right? So it's a drink. And oftentimes it shows up as being the dharma of heavenly, like heavenly rain of sweet dew, which is a kind of symbol for the dharma, symbol of the medicine of the teachings as it comes into our lives, etc. So Gate of Sweet Nectar, Ambrosia Gate, same thing. This idea of a heavenly nectar is common in probably all cultures in one way or another. We definitely see it in ancient India. In the Vedic times that Buddhism grew up in, there was the understanding that the immortals, the gods, that they had this elixir, and if you drank it, you would live forever. Or maybe it's better to say you could avoid death. And so this kind of elixir of immortality was part of the way that people thought about existence and the existence of certain kinds of being. Over time, through Buddhism, that got associated with nirvana. So nirvana, or liberation, is a place where death no longer rules life. And so this same thing, which before was thought of in a more literal sense of immortality, now became a symbol of the liberation of nirvana in which dying was no longer what we're oriented in, being born and dying. We're oriented in something that is more fundamental or beyond that, liberation. And so in Buddhism, when we talk about the ambrosia or the sweet nectar, we're talking about the Dharma. We're talking about the teachings, the practices, the way of living that is oriented in liberation and points towards liberation, liberation from all of the stuck ways that we undercut the fullness of being. So in your book there, I just want to point out what we're talking about when we're talking about this particular teaching. Again, I'll talk more about that next week. But in the ritual work that we do every weekday through the month of October, that then culminates in a ceremony called Osegaki, or the great offerings to the hungry ghost ceremony. That will happen this year on the 29th, I believe, Sunday the 29th. And just a couple of days before Halloween. We always put it close to Halloween. I'll go into that in a couple of minutes here. But in that ceremony, there's a few different things that we chant. Probably the first thing in your book is the Makahani Haramita Shingyo. Is that right? Okay, I don't have one, so I'm going to guess. And then the next one is probably Daishin Dharani, or Great Compassionate Heart Dharani. Is that right? Okay. So those two parts are the Makahani Haramita Shingyo, like we chant in the Sunday mornings, the Heart of Great Wisdom Sutra, and we're making offerings to the Buddha. Then the assembly turns, and we're offering compassion to these ghosts, which we're going to gather together, ghosts and spirits. And that's why we then chant the Great Compassionate Heart Dharani, Daishin Dharani. And then from there, then there's an invocation of some really important beings. The Buddhas, the Dharmas, the Sanghas, our original teacher, Shakyamuni Buddha, Avalokiteshvara, who shows up prominently in the story, and Ananda, who is one of the closest disciples of the Buddha. On our altar here, he's to the right of the Buddha. He's in Gasho like this, right to the right of the Buddha. That's Ananda, his close attendant. And so, so we invoke their names, and then we enter into this block of text, which usually when people say the Ambrosia Gate, it's this block of text and then all the mantras that follow it, or the dharanis that follow it, that people are talking about. And I'm going to talk about that part of the text next week quite a bit more, but it's really amazing. To me, it's one of the hearts of Mahayana Buddhism. It was written by a monk named Menzan, who many of you are coming to Thursday night assembly these days, where we're studying one of his texts that's very kind of pointing about Zazen. This text is also about the heart of practice, but it's about the heart of practice of how do we encounter desire. How do we encounter desire? What is the work of a bodhisattva in relationship to thirst and hunger and longing? That's what Menzan is pointing us at. Okay, you can put those down now. If you want to keep looking at them, you're fine, but you don't need to. So before we get into the practice itself, I want to talk about ghosts a little bit. I love saying the word ghost.
Me too.
Because people just a little like, what are you talking about? I thought we got over that. I'm not sure what's going on. And so I want to make a little case for why words like ghost and spirit, soul, there's a lot of different of these slippery words that we've mostly banished from our vocabulary, unless we're involved in a fantasy movie of some kind, or fantasy book, right? And in Chinese characters, there are different characters that get used when we talk about these kind of collection of beings, different types of beings. One of them that usually gets translated as spirit, in Japanese is the way it's pronounced is they. This has a kind of connotation of divinity, maybe. But not divinity like the way that we think about it in Abrahamic faiths, but divinity more like the spirits of places. Kami is another word that you might have heard. This is more in Japan than in other. It's very strongly emphasized in Japan. Kami, like if you come to a mountain, there is a god of the mountain. This is just like obvious to people. There is a divinity of the mountain. There is a spirit of the mountain. Okay? Now, the thing that's tricky about this is that people don't mean that there's a mountain and the mountain doesn't really matter. It's just kind of a container for this spirit. The mountain and the spirit are indivisible. The mountain is the spirit, and the spirit is the mountain. Is this kind of understanding, which I think is pretty universal in non-Western scientific rational societies. Like, people just get that. I've not been to that many different places. I've read about a few more different places, but it seems like not a complicated move for most of humanity. For us, it's a little complicated because we've been very carefully educated to think about being objective and being able to measure things. And we've looked into some of the problems that come from not having a handle on subjectivity, not having a handle on the ways in which we can just project all of our individual desires and things onto the world and create problems with that. So I'm not saying that this Western approach is bad, but just we've been alienated from this a little bit. Right? So when I say divinity, I mean like there's a spirit of things, and really everywhere. Right? It's not that there is a God that fills up everything. That's a very, very kind of monotheistic notion. It's that everything itself has the juice. Right? Like I've been really fond of this image lately. It's like, we really like juice, like apple juice. I don't like juice very much. You know what I like? I like apples. You don't try to get the juice out of the apple and leave the apple behind. You just eat the apple, right? No, please drink juice if you like juice. But sometimes you have too many apples, and what are you going to do? You make cider, and you might let it sit around for a while. People do that too. But the apple and the juice are one thing. The mountain and the mountain spirit are one thing. The same with the river. The same for our fig tree. The same for every blade of grass. Right? So that's one kind of quality. Another quality, though, are these things in Japanese called oni. The character sometimes gets translated as ogre, sometimes as like demon, sometimes as like devil. And these are a little bit less, they're usually less translucent. They kind of usually show up with a little more corporeal gusto. They're kind of like usually more fleshy, right? And they're usually creating some problems. Right? Not always, but they're usually, they're in the mix with us all. And they're in the mix of their appetites, and our appetites clash sometimes. And that is humans like being the center of attention. And then there's another class, which are the shapeshifters. So these are, in Japanese they call them bakemono, and there's a number of animals like foxes and badgers, for example. It's actually a Japanese raccoon dog, is what it is technically. It's called a tanuki. And they're always shifting shapes, and they're changing into these different shapes to usually pull one over on humans, right? Because we need that. The foxes are seen to be messengers of the gods, so they take messages, but they also show up in these very kind of interesting ways. Now, if we look into, these are all I'm only talking about Japanese things right now, but we have this in all of our traditions, all of our lives, all of our ancestries. We have these kinds of stories. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is because when we talk about feeding the hungry ghosts, we have to figure out what to do with that. What do we mean? I remember the very first Segaki we had here, I think it was Yu Myobun, who said to me, "So did we feed them? Did we feed them?" And that's the question. Like, are we just playing? Are we just doing something that we could have an interpretation of, we could psychologize in some way, which I think is helpful? Or is there something happening in the ritual that can't really be reduced to something else? And my argument is, there's something happening that you can't really reduce. You can't reduce it to some other kind of explanation. And the reason I think this is so important and why I emphasize it, and I would say that in Western Buddhism, Western Zen in particular, almost all of this has been left behind until relatively recently. great Zen scholar and teacher, D.T. Suzuki, which was one of the first people to bring this wonderful medicine to the West, said outright, feeding hungry ghosts is something that's been added on top. It has nothing to do with Buddhism.
Excuse me, who said it?
D.T. Suzuki. Yeah. So again, great teacher and brought so many wonderful things, but that they had a difficult thing to do. They're trying to bring a teaching from a rich tradition embedded in a culture in which nobody needs to explain any of this stuff. And the rational mind that was so strong at the time, that was working to leave behind some of the things that really got us stuck because we were so embedded in these cultural ways of doing things we couldn't get out. And in Japan, just as much as anywhere else, a person like D.T. Suzuki was like, we got to cut through this, leave it behind. Okay? So our tradition in the West has largely been informed by that kind of mindset. Right? But there's a problem with it. And the problem is, within rationality, within a kind of scientific materialist viewpoint, we get stuck in the world of subject and object. It is fundamental to being able to work in that world. You need to be able to encounter objects in a consistent way. The only way to do that is to be the subject that is measuring an object and to relate with it in that way. And when you do that, you can nail a lot of things down. It's great. You can go to the moon, and cure a bunch of really nasty diseases and figure out some of the stuff that was just kind of baloney that the priest was telling you to skim a little off the top. All right? So these are all good advances. They can bring about many wonderful things. But the limitation is we don't know how to deal with things that don't live so conveniently in the subject-object split. Like, if we just get down to, kind of a simple, I don't know if it's simple or not, but a straightforward way, it's just like, you're involved. No matter what you're experiencing, no matter what's going on, you're involved, right? And the deal with the subject-object thing is, it's like, it's out there. Let's talk about out there. And then even when we look inside, like psychologically, to try to understand what's going on, we make our inside outside. Like we like diagnose. We try to figure out what's the working of my mind, and we try to say what it is, and we try to make a map of it or whatever. We're constantly in this process of objectifying. And in that process of objectifying, there's a lot of stuff that can't happen. One of them's healing. Okay, I'll say it again. One of them's healing. Really deep healing. Now, you can fix things, but healing is another thing. Healing is something where the subject and object no longer lives in opposition. The healing, real true healing, is an uncovering of the total interdependence of being, which includes all the stuff in my physical body and my emotional body, my psychological body, and the body of everything, which I am not separate from. And so these traditions that have these things that sound a little weird to us now, like ghost or spirit, or can sound weird to us. These are rich traditions of healing. They're rich traditions of finding out about wholeness and what is our path of wholeness. When we talk about a spirit or a ghost, one of the characteristics of a spirit is it's not so clear, this inside and outside business. Did I just imagine the spirit, or was the spirit there? Now, if you're watching Ghost Hunters or something, which is good fun, but they're trying to objectify, and maybe there's something there. A lot of mystics will tell you, oh yeah, this stuff also lives in the material world, and it can have effects there. Okay, but I don't want to even debate that. I think it's probably true. I don't have tons of experience with that, but it's not what I think is most important. What I think is most important is I don't have to find some like woo-woo thing happening in an objective world. I'm full of woo-woo all the time. There's all kinds of mystery right here that I don't understand. There's all kinds of things happening, peering out of the dark, inviting me this way and that. So when we hear something like spirit, like if you're walking in the mountain, you're walking by the river. Let's take river. You're walking by the river, and you just know there's a spirit. The river itself is the face of the spirit. Right? But you can't say it's not in you too. That's one of the things that's so healing about that kind of encounter, is you know that that river is not, it's not something that's out there. The river's flowing through you. And because it's flowing through you, there's also that river that's there. Okay? This is what a teaching about spirit can open the door to. It's not just, oh, well, yeah, it's there, and I'm getting the visual data, and the thing that's going through and hit my eardrums, and blah, 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 and I can hear the sound and the, you know, all the time giving this explanation of how it's over there, and I can receive some information about it. When we start talking about spirit, we know, like, oh, this body is whole. When we talk in terms of spirit or ghost or ogre, it emphasizes that I'm included. These kinds of stories are always relational when we talk about these beings. They're not just out there. They're always showing up in relation. That's true of everything all the time, but these stories carry that clearly. And so when we enter the world of spirit, or we start looking with the eyes that can appreciate the world of spirit, other things become possible. So this story of Ananda and the Buddha and a character named Enku, or Blazing Mouth, is this kind of a story. And this happened at the time of the Buddha, while the community was dwelling outside of Kapilavastu castle at a park that was there. And the early mendicant community, they're like hippies, kind of, you know. They will go around different places and they kind of set up camp. And then they would hang out there. But hanging out meant they would meditate. And then each day they would come into the town. It was usually at the edge of a town. They would come into town for alms rounds. They received their alms. And then they would come back to where they were staying for a time. And they would eat their food, wash their bowls, put them away, fold their robes. And then they would listen to a teaching by the Buddha. In this very simple way that the mendicant community, the renunciate community lived. And then also people from the town could come and they could listen to the teaching, people who weren't part of the renunciate community. So this is the setting. And so they're dwelling there, and it's late at night, and Ananda's in meditation. They're probably in retreat of some kind. And he's visited by this being while he's deep in meditation. A wild creature appears before him named Enku, or Blazing Mouth. And the descriptions, there's a sutra called the Sutra of Enku, the Sutra of Blazing Mouth, and wild descriptions of the like crazy hair and wild flaming eyes, and a mouth in which he's just belching fire, and a pencil thin neck and a big stomach. This is the image of the Gaki, or the hungry ghost. And everybody in South Asia at that time would know that image. Hungry ghosts were part of their world of the spirits, okay? And they still are. That's spread through Southeast Asia, East Asia, Japan. Everyone has this image of this being that is eternally hungry, but they can't be satisfied. Right? Sound familiar? So he's visited by Enku, and he asks him his name. I love this part of the story. Ananda isn't like, whoa, must be some mistake. I'm a great monk. I'm meditating. This is Makyo. This is a vision that is not real. I will simply dismiss it through the force of my mind, right? Which is a very common Zen approach to these sorts of things. But Ananda doesn't do that. Ananda says, "What's your name? What's your name, face of desire?" And Enku says, "My name is Blazing Mouth." And then he goes on to say, "Ananda, in 3 days you will lose your life." And Ananda says, "Why?" And he says, "It's your karma," the great Buddhist explanation for everything. It's your karma. And he says, "Isn't there something I can do?" And Blazing Mouth says, "I'm sorry. Your karma is such that you will lose your life." And he says again, "Isn't there something I can do?" And Enku says, "Well, there is one thing, but it's impossible." And Ananda says, "Well, what is that?" And he said, "You have to satisfy me." And then he goes on to say, furthermore, not only do you have to satisfy me, you had to satisfy the whole realm of hungry ghosts, which is full of countless beings just like me. And if you can liberate all of them, then this would keep you from losing your life. Notice I'm not saying death, because it changes the story a little bit to think about, is he losing life? We don't even know, does that mean literally dying in the way we think of dying, or simply losing his life, losing his vitality, losing his way on the path? It's another way we can think of it. And so Enku disappears, and then he goes to the Buddha, which is a wise thing to do, especially if the Buddha's in flesh and around. And so he goes to the Buddha and he tells him the story, and the Buddha says, Ananda, don't worry. I've been taught a method. Enku thought it was impossible. I've been trying to tell him otherwise, right? But he doesn't listen. He's too hungry. He can't hear it. But there's a method, and I'll teach you the method, and we'll all enact it together. And the next day was the full moon ceremonies, where the Sangha would all gather together and do special ceremonies for the full moon. And so that's where the first enactment of these rituals, the method that Shakyamuni Buddha had learned, was put into play. And that is what we do on Segaki. That has been cared for 2,500 years. These incantations have been preserved, and they have slightly different shapes and different traditions, but those have been preserved for 2,500 years, and we enact that. So who do you think Shakyamuni Buddha learned the method from? He learned it from Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva, who is the Bodhisattva of compassion, who on our altar is not personified yet. The black calligraphy to the right of the Buddha, this is a seed syllable. It's kind of a way of writing a symbol that represents a Bodhisattva or a Buddha. This is for Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva, the Bodhisattva of compassion, who's said to have innumerable arms, and each arm has an eye in the hand, an eye of wisdom. And so this is a really beautiful image, that Avalokitesvara's seeing is touching. Avalokitesvara doesn't stay separate and see things. Doesn't see things. Avalokitesvara's healing comes from the inseparability of touch. And that's why Avalokitesvara knows how to overcome his hunger. It's beautiful. It's beautiful. Probably the most celebrated Bodhisattva, Avalokitesvara, Kuan Yin. So we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. But in this world of spirit, I want us to pay attention here to these gaki, these hungry ghosts. By the way, the characters I was talking about earlier, they're a ki, not a re. The re are the kind of ethereal ones, right? Not ethereal, they're like usually kind of cool, kind of more divine. The kis are the little more troublemakers. So the gaki are troublemakers, or they are, they're locked in negative karma. And as negative karma is wont to do, it just sort of is very sticky. So you try to treat it, you try to do something with the negative karma, and usually you get caught up in it in some way. And this is definitely true of desire. I don't know if you've noticed that before. The character for gaki, or hungry ghost, there's a lot of ways in Chinese you could write the word hunger, but this character is kind of one among many. It has a special quality. The left side of the character means to eat, and the right side of the character means self. Oftentimes that's the same character that would be used for like self-clinging. So it's interesting that that's the word for hunger. Like you could get interpretive on that a little bit. You could say, okay, it means that the self wants to eat, okay, or there's a being that wants to eat. But there's something about this character ga, which is like isolated, cut off, locked in the subject-object world, locked in thinking that eating is about myself putting something in me, right? that's where I'm going to get nourishment from. And I would say this is a deep quality of desire. We feel like there's something that we need to unify with, right? Whether that's food, whether that's romantic embrace, whether that's friendship, whether that's great success, anything. Whether that's keeping things away, which we prefer not to be involved in. All of those are this kind of quality of working with an outside world. There's a really fun story from the Prajnaparamita texts or stories, and it's about the great translator of the Prajnaparamita text, and he's on a journey, and he stops to take a rest by this river, and this ogre shows up, and the ogre has has a head right here in his belly of like a sage, of like a holy person, and he's kind of surprised. The translator's kind of surprised, and he says, "Well, who are you?" And he says, "Oh, my name is Jinsa, and I'm a demon that lives in these parts." And he says, "I'm so hungry for the Dharma. I'm so hungry for the teachings of liberation that I've been eating all of the sages that come by here. But I'm still not getting it." And then he says to him, he says, "But you carry this text. And when I saw the text, I was no longer hungry. I was satiated. And I don't know why. So you better get out of here while you still can." And he goes. And then this ogre becomes honored as a great protector of the Prajnaparamita Sutras. I like the story because it's funny, but I also like the story because I think it points at something that's really important for us to think about in our Buddhist practice. The image, or people might say the archetype, of the dried up desire of the saint is so powerful, you are almost for sure inflicting that on yourself. You're almost for sure thinking that if you could just get over your desire, if you could just keep the ice cream at arm's length, literally and metaphorically, that would be the holy route, right? And our tradition puts a lot of emphasis on that. If you look at the Four Noble Truths, first noble truth, suffering. Second noble truth, what's the cause of suffering? Thirst, desire, clinging, right? So that is a part of our tradition, and it's an important part. But what happens, and it's not held this way in most Buddhist countries, we have some other karma going on. I'm using we very liberally here, but it comes from a kind of very narrow-heartedness that I'd say in North America we're all part of in some way from living here. And it's a narrow-heartedness that wants to squeeze the juice out of things because we think that's holier for some reason. I don't really know why that's true, but it's definitely our karma. We don't need to know why. And so there's this way in which we come into practice where we think, if I could just banish Enku, if I could just get my desires out of here, everything would be fine. I would be able to become one with that image or that archetype of the saint who is selfless. We have a lot of teaching around this. So just get rid of your ego, everything will be great. Good luck. And actually, when you get rid of your ego, you can't touch anything. Healing's gone. You might be dried up, but you can't actually do the work of the Bodhisattva. So when we look at our teachings, there is one side to it which is referred to as this dry path. And it ends up in the great accomplishments of the arhats. The arhats are dried up. They've gotten rid of all their desire. And they're a great image of what it means to overcome desire. How there can be great joy without the objects of your desire being fulfilled. Right? There can be great joy there. And the arhats become a symbol of that for us. So they're important. But the emphasis in the Mahayana is on the bodhisattva. So when we look at the lives of the bodhisattvas, particularly the life of Shakyamuni Buddha, the many, many, many lives of Shakyamuni Buddha, which are recorded in a collection of works called the Jataka Tales, we see life after life after life where Shakyamuni Buddha gives a damn. He cares about things, has desire, wants to see things moving towards liberation, and acts accordingly. So if we think about the first two noble truth of suffering, noble truth of clinging as the origin of suffering, we need to make sure to go on to the third noble truth and the fourth noble truth, the third noble truth being cessation or liberation, nirvana, and the fourth being path. The fourth marga, path, is oftentimes called, in its original form was the Eightfold Path, but it really means all of the ways of practicing Buddha Dharma. And none of those say, simply ignore your desire and it will go away. And then you will be happy. That's not what it says. It says we have to transform. We have to transform our deep thirst. And as we transform that deep thirst, something becomes possible. That we can find a way forward to wholeness. In fact, our thirst becomes an important gate to finding out what's important. If we break this down into really kind of everyday things, when you realize someone's hungry and you want to feed them, where does that come from? You have to know hunger to know someone's hungry. Your own desire is not just a hindrance. It's part of the living body of all beings that from one angle can be pretty rough because we're all eating each other. But from another angle, we all know each other's life and what it requires. So desire is necessary to understand nourishment. And nourishment is necessary, to understand nourishment is necessary to understand generosity. How can I actually be generous to other beings in a way that leads to liberation? How can I be generous to myself in a way that leads to liberation? This is what the Gate of Sweet Nectar is about. Our daughter Satsuki was a pro at this. She loved to eat. It was so fun. Sometimes, I'd have something here at the evening at the temple, so I'd be home kind of eating early. I'd be sitting at the island eating something, and she just had a snack, came home from school, whatever, and she'd go, "Hey, Dad," she'd walk by, and every single time it would be like, "Stop, look." She'd kind of touch her belly. Didn't matter if she was full or not. She'd be like, "Can I have a bite?" "Can I have a bite?" And I always give her a bite. And we always thought that she probably would grow up and become like a restaurant reviewer or stuff. She was very strict, actually, about all these little things. But the thing about Satsuki was so cool, and why when I was choosing her Dharma name when she passed away, her Dharma name means gentle offering, because she knew that she was forever putting food in people's mouths. Like her friends would come over, she's like, "Oh, eat this, eat this, eat this, eat this." And it wasn't like she was just there to taste your food. If she was eating anything, she want you to taste it. Like a child does, they're eating something. It could be like a snotty apple, kind of like that. But they want you to eat it too, right? So that's the thing I really learned from her. That my own desires can be enacted in a way that is touching and being touched. And this inside-outside issue that the hungry ghosts don't know what to do about, that touch liberates them. And that's what this ritual is about. How do we touch the desire that feels like it can't be fulfilled? It will only want more for itself. There's a way to do this. It's called Buddhist practice. And the Seigaki sits right in the center of that. So next week I'll talk more about the ritual itself and how we can learn from the ritual and learn from the teaching about how it is that we do that touching. We do have a little time if there's a question or two. Yes.
I had a friend, it's not a question, but reflecting on what you said, I had a very good friend who is no longer here, but he was much older than I am, and his wife practiced tea ceremony.
Yeah.
So they collected beautiful tea bowls and so on, and but anyway, so about the desire of buying beautiful things or admiring beautiful things. And one day he said, Satoko-san, it's okay to collect beautiful things and admire, but these are things. So someday you might have a tea bowl broken or a painting burned, depends on the situation. But he said, when it happens, you tell yourself, you have had this tea bowl for 10 years and you enjoyed it for 10 years. So it's okay to say goodbye. And that really kind of like made me relax about things, It's not like, oh, I can't buy this beautiful painting, or I can't buy this beautiful clothes, but these are things and it disappears. And as a matter of fact, there was Kansai Daishinsai, the great earthquake, 95, and their house was in the midst of it. And so his wife said all those ceramics and glasses that they collected just went down like waterfall. And I called them right away, and then they were all fine, but she said, oh, everything just went like a waterfall and then clicked. And then and then they came back to Eugene, and he just laughingly said, oh, Satoko-san, insurance companies, you just can't trust them. They just gave me only like $100 sorry money. And he was just laughing. And I really admire him so much for how he was. He was very down to earth person.
Thank you. One thing I hear in that story is that it sounds like he and his wife did not relate to these bulls as things.
Pardon me?
They weren't things. They were people.
Right.
So if you think about that, of course, we're very sorry when we lose a person that we're close to. That's really terrible. But it's very different than the breaking of a bull. Like we think, oh, I lost my possession. If you can be a friend with the bull, then when it's the bull's time to go, then you can appreciate that time. That's what I'm hearing in part what you're saying. And this is part and parcel of the way in which we objectify the world. And we live in a world of things. We're the subject. We're the star. And when we take a little shift from that, it's like, it doesn't have to be a huge thing. It's not like you have to come to some big realization and then you can do it. It's an attitude adjustment. Right? And you do the attitude adjustment over and over and over and over again. And when you feel yourself locking into that stiff-armed way of regarding the world as your collection of artifacts, go, oh, wait a minute. Shake it off a little bit. And laugh. I love that.
And as a matter of fact, that he died in my house in Eugene. So his word really stays in me very much. And so I was away, and his wife was here, and when I came, a couple of days later, she died. So she said, oh, he was waiting for you?
Thank you.
Ocho-san, you said do we have a practice where when a Sangha member or somebody, I can't remember exactly, when they pass, we'll sew a raksu for them, which is then they wear during their cremation. And you said that sometimes some teachers, they don't like the idea that you would burn a robe because it's like disrespectful, or you're destroying something. But then you said that's only if you believe the robe exists just in the material world. Can you speak more?
Yeah. So if we think of the robe as an object, then there's all these things hanging around people's necks, and they can come and go. And that is one layer that is not untrue. It has its own truth on that layer. But it's also true that every robe is the robe of the Buddha, and in that sense there's only one robe. There's only one body, and that one body is enveloped in this careful sewing together of the broken world, which is all of these pieces of fabric that get sewn together to make a robe. And so in that sense, a robe's burning is like obvious, and kind of trying to cling to a material form. That seems a mistake to me. But not because there is a thing inside the robe, which is called a spirit, which the robe doesn't really matter. We just need to take care of the spirit. I'm not saying that. I'm saying the robe, just like the river, is the spirit, is the robe. And that's the body that we easily forget when we're working with that body as you and me and those things and like all of that kind of thing. We easily forget it. And I think that happens within our practice all the time. Okay, this is my last advice, and then we'll go have cookies. Be excited about Segaki. Because it's fun, but also is a chance to really take your desires seriously. And more on that next week.